Hello again, everybody. We're going to be continuing on with Kansas history today, moving into chapter 5, um, kind of talking about how our state overcame some of the difficulties that we learned about in the last chapter and how it grew into the state that we know and love today. So, like I said, moving into chapter 5, our first lesson deals with tension on the frontier. At this time, Kansas was kind of wide open for settlement. After the Civil War, people were moving in. The slavery issue had been settled. Our state really was still dealing with some of those issues um, that you guys learned about the last chapter. Um, kind of being a poor state, being in debt after dealing with the Bleeding Kansas issues. Um, but people are starting to move here for a fresh start after the Civil War. So this is going to cause some conflicts with the Native Americans who still live here. We haven't talked about them much lately because we've been dealing with the slavery issue in Kansas and Kansas Territory and our state, but the Native Americans are going to be a factor as well right now too. So conflicts on the frontier are wide open state. Before the Civil War, we talked about the forts that were built here in Kansas Territory to keep the peace between the settlers and the Native Americans, and basically to protect white settlers. These forts were staffed with U.S. soldiers. They didn't have a war to deal with at that time, so they worked at the forts in order to protect the settlers who were in the area. Many of the soldiers at the Kansas forts left to go fight in the Civil War, obviously. After the Civil War, the forts were then staffed by state volunteer troops, almost like a National Guard type scenario here. But they felt less obligated to obey the federal government. They felt like they didn't necessarily didn't feel like they were required to do what the federal government was saying because they were in the state of Kansas. Um, Kind of a fun fact that goes along with this lesson. Laura Ingalls Wilder, she's of Little House on the Prairie fame, the author of her books that she wrote about her family's experience as settlers in Kansas, as well as Wisconsin, Minnesota. But her family, when they lived here near Independence, were actually squatters. Squatters were people who occupied land or property that they did not actually own. And the land that her family squatted on belonged to the Osage Indians, which wasn't open to settlement at the time. So the books that you may have read when you were a kid, Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family were living illegally here in our little corner of the state. If you haven't read the Little House series, while we're on quarantine, you might go ahead and pick those up and read the series. It's an awesome series. Um, Gives you a little bit of insight as to what life was like here on the plains back in the 1800s. Moving on, buffalo soldiers were a thing here in Kansas, and these weren't actual buffaloes who went to fight in the military, not at all. But buffalo soldiers were actually African American soldiers who fought in particular cavalries, the 9th and 10th Cavalries actually, and they kind of worked with the Native Americans here in Kansas. But back in the day, African American soldiers were allowed to serve in peacetime cavalry armies after the Civil War. However, they were segregated. They were separated by race. They were kept apart from white soldiers and had their own specific regiments. But these black soldiers in the 9th and 10th Cavalries, they were called Buffalo Soldiers. And they had specific jobs. Their job was to evict people squatting on Indian land. People who, their job was to make people leave a place, sometimes by force if needed. But the name may have came from the Kiowa Indian tribe because the regiment members were worthy opponents and because the Plains Indians respected buffalo. So they offered that name to these particular soldiers. Um, kind of some issues that were going on between settlers and soldiers and Native Americans at this time. An event called the Sand Creek Massacre happened. This was where 150 Cheyennes and Arapaho Indians were murdered by American troops along Colorado's Sand Creek, which technically was outside of Kansas, but did have some Kansas history ties here. But as settlers moved west, some Indians wanted peace, some wanted to resist with violence. Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle met in Washington, D.C. to work for peace for his people, as well as in Colorado with the governor and Colonel Shivington. Black Kettle was betrayed by Colonel Shivington, and his camp was surrounded and his people were killed. A lot of distrust here between the Native Americans and the soldiers, and this led to even more distrust between Indians and Americans in general. They believed that people were not going to do what they said, and they didn't have any reason to trust them. This also led into the Plains Wars. Native Americans saw that their survival was being threatened by settlers and killing millions of buffalo for sport, as well as more and more towns popping up in Indian territory. The conflicts started to break out. Their land was being taken, their resources were being taken. They didn't like it. Obviously, I mean, I don't blame them. A general by the name of General Hancock and his men were sent to Kansas to stop the fighting, and they even burned an Indian village. This led to even more battles breaking out, again with that trust issue. And all really probably boiled down to a lack of communication. Eventually, the U.S. government wanted to make peace with the Kansas Indians. If disagreements were still happening, it was going to cause the settlers to have trouble setting up their homes in Kansas. So the government wanted to get this straightened out. So they signed what was called the Medicine Lodge Peace Treaty. But the government officials met with the Kansas Indians along the Medicine Lodge River, and Satanta, who was a Kiowa chief who was representing his tribe at the council. He was a great orator, a great speaker. He was very good at it. His people trusted him to portray their opinions, so he was asked to be the orator for this, and he spoke on the Indians' behalf. The peace treaty was signed. Indians were given protection on reservations. However, there was still fighting that continued because some of the Indians chose not to live on reservations. They felt like their freedom was being taken. So it solved some problems, yet some problems still continued. The frontier continued to change as more and more settlers arrived and Indians were being forced onto reservations. The railroad eventually spread into Kansas and actually further west into the United States, and that ended the frontier of our state. It was a huge improvement for transportation. When the railroads reached Kansas during territorial times, the legislature had given charters, which were special documents granting special rights to a person or a group. Basically gave them the right to do certain things in order to help the railroads continue. But these charters were given to 51 different railroad companies, and this allowed the individual companies to build railroads across our state. However, Bleeding Kansas happened, all the violence going on with that, and that deterred railroad development, temporarily stopped. During the Civil War, President Lincoln approved the Pacific Railroad Act. This was an act that allowed 3 smaller railroads to branch off the main line in Kansas, which helped the railroad business boom and continue even more. It connected Kansas to the rest of the country, and by doing this, it forever changed our state. Things would never be the same. And we will pick up with how people came to Kansas to settle a different way. They came by railroad, and we'll get into that more with the next lesson. And I wish you all a great day.